Hello, this is Carolyn, and this segment is about avoiding those practical mistakes that we make in grant writing. So it's not about the content in terms of how excellent it is in terms of scholarship. We're now looking at these mistakes that many grant writers make. They're common mistakes, and they're commonly seen, and they're devastating to your chances of getting funded, but they're easily avoided. And I call this my highlighter pen methodology. So this is why I have my highlighter pens. And there are three things that we're going to be looking for. So when I get a piece of paper or a document that says we're offering funding, so it can be called an RFA, a request for application, a request for proposals, maybe it's a potential for a cooperative agreement. There's going to be documentation, and in some cases, I've actually responded to grants where those documents are 100 pages long. I mean, they can be really quite extensive. And it's very important that you read them carefully and that you not miss anything, because the other thing that I've noticed is that occasionally things that are important in terms of the submission don't all appear in the same piece of the grant. It's not as if you're going to have one page which gives you everything you need to know about the submission. So we're going to use three different colors of highlighter pens. And the first is about the mandatory content. What must you include in terms of substance? If they say we need a literature review, if they say you need a logic model, if they say that you need letters of support from colleagues, if they say that you need a detailed evaluation plan, each one of those is it's a piece that must be there. It's mandatory content. It's scored. If you leave it out, you're not even going to go to review very often. Now, some people are puzzled when I say this because they say, well, I can understand that it would weaken my score if I leave out a piece, but why am I not even going to go to review? Well, in some cases, with big funding agencies, what's going to happen is when these grants come in, either in paper or more often now submitted online, they're going to have somebody who may be administrative, clerical, or junior staff look at each of these applications, and that person is going to be saying, do they have their letters? Do they have the logic model? Do they have this plan? Because if they don't, we're not going to review them. And I'm going to come back and explain why that is at the end of our little time together. The second piece that you're going to be looking for is you're going to be looking for structure and formatting. What do they want? And the joke I always make is if they say, I want this on lilac recycled paper and I want you to use a calligraphy font in size 13, you're going to give it to them. Because it has nothing to do at all with what they want to see aesthetically. It has to do with whether they can see that you read and follow instructions. If they're going to give you money to do a project, and that comes with some accountability requirements such as reporting and meeting deadlines, they want to see that you read the instructions and that you follow them. Sometimes they'll tell you, and this also has to do with the font size. So for example, they may say, we want you to use a Times New Roman 12 font, but you may say use a 10 font in the tables. Now this is important because it can help you in terms of how much you can get into your grant, but you have to read these things. And so what I do with my second pen is I will go through and I will highlight everything about structure and formatting. They're also going to tell you things about how to deliver it. So they may say, we don't want any plastic covering. We want 2 originals and 10 copies. If they say 2 originals, they mean 2 originals. And one of the tricks that I would suggest if you are submitting originals and you need to show that they're originals is if you sign them in blue ink, if that's permitted, because then they can see it's an original and not a photocopy. Then the third thing we're looking for is something that is maybe not obvious always, but it has to do with the language. Now, I'm a fairly informal person, and so you will very seldom hear me use the word operationalize, for example. I'm going to say, how are we going to make it happen? But if in the request for applications, the grants, it says, the grant funder is saying, demonstrate how you will operationalize this plan, you can be absolutely sure that I am going to use the word operationalize when I write my application. And it's not just about little words like this, but it's also about the language that they're using that is trying, or is not trying to, it's meant to convey the purpose of this funding announcement. So if they're talking about developing capacity or building sustainable programs, or the fact that they want it to be a collaborative effort. These are key words, and you need to give them back to the funding agency. So I will then go through with the third color, and I will highlight bits of language that I think are important to the funding agency. Now, another reason that this can be important to you is that sometimes the people who are screening the grant are also looking for some of these key concepts and whether or not these key pieces are reflected in the response to the request for funding. And the more often you can give them the language back, the easier it is for them to realize that you have done it. So say, for example, in the language it says, respondent must demonstrate accountability by doing such and such. You might start your sentence by saying, we will demonstrate accountability by. So you're actually lifting their language and you're putting it back into the body of your grant. So we start with the marker pens, we mark up the proposal request. If it's complicated, so if it's a grant which has lots of rules and regulations, then sometimes I will make a summary of what those are, or sometimes we'll mark up, if it's a big request, we'll actually mark it up with sticky notes or flags so that we can very quickly get back to those instructions. The other tip I've shared with you is if there are mandated sections, so they say include this section, and they've included the number of points that will be assigned to scoring, say, the evaluation plan, then what I recommend you do is this. Open up a document in your word processing, whatever it is that you use, and go into that document and put in every heading that is required. So evaluation plan, action plan, logic model. Put it in as a placeholder, and then in parentheses behind that title, put in the number of points that are going to be assigned to that section. And if it helps you, and I've done this on a couple of bigger grants, actually cut the scoring criteria into the document. Now, if you're going to put these scoring criteria and these grade points into the document, be very careful that you put them in a bright color like green or red so that it's obvious to you and to everybody else that they should not be there in the final version, because you don't want to send that to the funder. That would not be a good idea. But what's helpful then is as you come to write each section and as you come to address each section, you know how much time you should be spending on it, you know how important it is relative to the final score of the whole grant, and it means that you don't miss things. It's absolutely critical. Because remember, if you're like most of us here, if you're writing a grant, you are often doing it at 2 a.m, and even if it isn't in the early hours of the morning, it's that you're tired, you're stressed. Very often you're in a very tight time crunch. You don't have a lot of time to turn this around. And the less time you waste going back and back and back and checking instructions, the better it's going to be for you. So having said all of this, once you've set yourself up to actually know what it is that has to be in, you've written your grant, then you come to the point where you're going to submit it. Now this is what I call SWOT +2. Or putting yourself into your funder's shoes. SWOT, of course, is the first part, and SWOT is SWOT analysis, and it's a concept that we use in strategic planning, and it's not typically used for grant writing, and in fact, we're not using it in its most traditional sense. We're using it in a sort of adapted sense, but that's okay, because we're making the rules here, right? So, SWOT. In typical SWOT, people are saying what are the strengths that we have in our program, what are the weaknesses, what are the opportunities that we should be leveraging, and what are the threats to this program working or succeeding. Now, your grant reviewer, whether or not they're thinking it or not, is essentially SWOTting your proposal. They're saying what is strong about this proposal, both in terms of its concept, its design, the people who are part of the team, the way it's setting itself out in terms of how realistic are the goals and deadlines. What's weak? Is it that your sample size is low? Is it that maybe you don't have people that are quite as experienced, or maybe you don't have really some of the resources that you need? That could be a problem. Weaknesses are a problem, but then they're going to say, Well, what opportunities have they leveraged in order to get this work done? Are they showing that they have strategic partnerships? Maybe they don't have money to have somebody very senior on this grant for a reasonable amount of time, but maybe they have them on in an advisory capacity, for example. So they're going to be looking to say, what opportunities have you leveraged to really strengthen your grant? And at this point, I just want to tell you that in-kind resources, in-kind funding are great opportunities. And if you can have these in-kind resources, when you're asking for money, basically you're saying, I'm asking you for so much money, but this money is going to buy a lot more than you would think you're buying because of our in-kind resources. And then finally, they're going to be saying, what are the potential threats, either to this program having an effect, or also what are the potential threats to this program happening on time and doing what we need it to do. So please, if you have time, SWOT this proposal. You have to be thinking like the grant reviewer. And if you find weaknesses or threats and you aren't able to address them immediately, you need to discuss them in your application. You cannot hide them. You can't sweep them under the carpet and think that the reviewer is not going to notice. If you are open about the potential weaknesses and threats and you address how you're going to be monitoring for these and addressing these, the reviewer is going to be okay. Well, I mean, they may not be thrilled, but at least they're going to say this person is aware that these are potential issues with this application. If you sweep them away and hope that they're not going to see them, they are just going to think that you're inexperienced and clueless. They're going to say, don't they realize that this is a problem? Don't they realize that this potentially could go wrong here? And you basically, they don't think, well, they're trying to hide something. They really think that you didn't understand that there was potentially a problem. You do not want to put yourself in this position. So that is SWOT. Now, what is the +2? The +2 is this. You need to proofread your application. The wonderful thing about word processing is cut and paste. The terrible thing about word processing is cut and paste. What's even worse is copy and paste. And those of us who are risk averse want to copy and paste it and not cut it, right? But as somebody who's reviewed a lot of grants, let me tell you that it is really frustrating when you are reading this application to find somewhere later down in a page that same paragraph or that same sentence that you've just read again. It's very clear that somebody copied something and didn't bother to check that they had eliminated the first piece. The other thing that can happen when you copy and paste bits and pieces is that your verbs don't agree with your nouns and so on, so that you will find two verbs, you'll find repeated words. You have to check this. And it's really important that you proofread, and ideally that you have somebody else proofread this for you, because we all know that when we proofread something that we've read 100 times, we're not going to see the mistakes. So preferably have somebody who hasn't written it proofread it, and even better, somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about the topic proofread it, because they're going to see the mistakes. And then you have to check one more time that these critical issues that you identified with your pens are in fact reflected in your application. Do you have all the required content? Is it structured correctly? Have you done what they've told you to do in terms of the numbers of copies, the signatures, the letters, and so on? You have to do this. And this is why. Remember, when it gets to the funding agency, they are going to check. And if you have not followed these rules, you are not going to review. You are going to be recycled, and your work, all that work that you've put together, is for nothing because you made a couple of small practical errors. So please remember that these are the tips that are going to possibly separate you from the other people who don't make it to review. Don't throw away points, and don't throw away the opportunity to be reviewed. And finally, if you get reviewed and you don't succeed, think about these things. The first is, as in Monopoly, if you don't pass go, you don't collect any money. So if you don't come to review, you can never be successful. And the tragedy of that is not only do you not get funded, but you don't get any feedback from the reviewers. And this is something that I want to say to you, as disillusioning as it is not to get funded, as frustrating as it feels, you need to understand that the people who are on that review committee are experts. They have been picked for a reason. It's not a coincidence that they know a lot about your topic. If you're working internationally, it's not a coincidence that they may have worked in that same exact part of that country. So they have picked reviewers for their knowledge and their understanding of both the context and the content. And so when you get feedback from your reviewer, even if they don't fund you, it's gold. Take it as free expert advice. They are going to tell you things that potentially will strengthen your hand next time. I want to say one thing about arrogance here. As someone who sat on review committees, I have had the experience of advice going two ways. We've had grants that were offered advice for how they could improve the submission that came back, and the applicants had said, "Thank you for that feedback. We have responded to your feedback and we have strengthened our proposal using your feedback." That's great. That's what the reviewers want to see. They want to see that you use their advice to strengthen your proposal. In the same review meeting that I was sitting in, at which we had this positive experience with somebody taking advice and strengthening their grant and ultimately getting funded, we had another application that said something like this: "Well, thank you for that feedback, but we respectfully disagree with you." And I think that I've actually shared in class what the chairperson of the review committee did with this application. This was an application to work internationally, and the chairperson of the committee picked up this piece of paper and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, in this response we have witnessed such a degree of arrogance and failure to be helped and informed that we are not going to inflict this arrogance internationally." And he literally put it down and it never went to review. So I think that you have to understand that not only is this an incredible gift that you get from the reviewers, but you have to treat it very, very carefully. And finally, remember, if you don't get funded, give it another try. Try again. The first time is the scariest time. The first time is the hardest time. But if you try, and if you use the advice that's given to you by the reviewers, and if you follow the directions with your highlighter pens to help you, you will eventually succeed.